Hello, my friend. How are you? So, I was gifted this little book by my mother quite some time ago, actually. And it is the Constitution of the United States of America with the Declaration of Independence. And you can see that it's not very big, and the size of it gave me the idea that I would just go through it and actually read it. So, if you feel so inclined to join me, I'm going to read the introduction. I think we'll see how far I get. I may read the entire introduction right now, and then perhaps I'll go through the entire thing as time goes. So, well, here we go. Without further ado, so here's the introduction to this little book. Again, the introduction is not the Constitution or the Declaration. It's simply the introduction to this particular book. Introduction. The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty words. They are written, as with the sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased. Alexander Hamilton, The Farmer Refuted, 1775. These documents, written on old parchments, squirreled away among musty records, remain living realities because they eloquently record the sacred rights and responsibilities of human beings. That's actually very important and interesting correlation there. Rights and responsibilities. I've talked about this before. You do not get rights without responsibilities. There is no such thing as a right which comes without a responsibility. I think that's critical. We still think about the enduring challenges of government in terms coined by the revolutionary generation of Americans. They thought more deeply and argued more vigorously about these challenges than any generation after them, leaving us a series of unprecedented experiments in nation building and constitution making. We often forget just how revolutionary the creation of the United States was. However, the Americans of that era never forgot it. Revisiting these documents enables us to grasp the American experiment's revolutionary quality. 1. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, the central document of American political life, codifies the American political creed. To understand it, however, we must know its origins and purpose. The Declaration was the last American word in the argument between Great Britain and its American colonists. In 1763, the British Empire, the most successful and the freest that the world has ever seen, had no more loyal subjects than the colonists of the 13 mainland colonies of British North America. Within 2 years, however, the first stirrings of disagreement between Britain and the colonists began to disturb peace within the empire. 2 years after the end of the French and Indian 7 Years' War, Britain confronted massive war debts. Convinced that the colonists had a free ride on the back of the British taxpayer, British politicians decided to redress the balance by taxing them. But the colonists protested that these taxes were unconstitutional. Huh. A debate as old as time, I suppose. People generally never agree on who should pay for what. And one of the problems with taxation arguments is that the taxes rarely flow in a direction which appeases everybody. In fact, it's basically impossible. If you were to look at a political map and then compare it to a population density map, it's the same map. I mean, anywhere there's population density, you have a certain collection of political opinions. Anywhere there's not, you have a different presence of different political opinions. And the colonies were not very population dense. But England by this time would have been much more, at least proportionately. And so even as early as, 1763, according to this document, um, we already have, and we've had for much longer than that, but we already have the dichotomy present. This is the reason why I always tell people, doesn't matter where someone went to school, it doesn't matter who their parents were, it doesn't matter, like all of these things don't really matter, um, in terms of predicting, a person's political bend. What really matters is how many people did they grow up next to? That's the primary driver of political sentiment. And of course, people always diverge, but on average, incentive structures are the easiest way to predict how a person is going to think and feel about things. So I'm not surprised that the British wanted to tax the relatively rural American colonies. The controversy put the nature of the British Constitution into dispute. Unlike the United States Constitution, the British Constitution is not one authoritative document framed and adopted at a specific time. Rather, it is the mass of laws, judicial decisions, documents having constitutional status, such as the Magna Carta, and customs making up or constituting the British government. Because the British Constitution is unwritten, an array of understandings and of its principles could spring up. Two of these marked out the opposing positions between the colonists and Britain. The colonists saw the British Constitution as a restraint on arbitrary power. Each of its three major institutions, the Crown, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, had the power to check on the other two. Arbitrary or unchecked power went beyond actual tyranny to include potential tyranny. When Parliament made laws for the colonies as the empire's supreme authority, it was acting arbitrarily. In particular, taxation without representation was tyranny. Parliament could not tax the colonists because they could not vote for members of the House of Commons. Only the colonial legislatures could tax the colonists. This is the American argument. So the Americans are basically saying we can't vote on whether these taxes should pass or not. Therefore, it's tyrannical to impose them on us because it's arbitrary. We have no say. It's coming totally from an exterior source. By contrast, the British happily gave Parliament its role as the supreme institution in their constitutional system. Parliament had earned this role by defending liberty against the Stuart kings, Charles I and James II. Each member of the House of Commons represented not just those who elected him, but all of the king's subjects. Under this idea of virtual representation, Parliament could tax the colonists and make laws for them, though they were not actually represented. Interesting. So they're saying, no, you do have representation, but it's representation, well, it's representation by a representative. This is actually sort of the same idea that we have in terms of our republic. We elect an official, and then that official represents us. So they're saying, no, this is fine. And honestly, like the system we ended up choosing kind of proves the British point, I guess, in a sense. In arguing with Britain, the 13 colonies, which previously were closer to the mother country than to one another, learned that they had a common cause, defending their liberties. This insight, fostered by the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 and the First Continental Congress of 1774, led them to see themselves as Americans. By 1776, the argument between Britain and the colonies had reached a stalemate. The British were not listening to the Americans and had sent British soldiers to bring the colonists under control. The reality of war, which began at Lexington and Concord in 1775, opened American minds to the idea of independence from Britain. That January, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, offered a powerful case for independence. Beginning by demolishing monarchy, the last linchpin of American loyalty to Britain, Paine showed that the Americans deserved independence and could win it, persuading hundreds of thousands to see independence as legitimate and desirable. 4 months later, in May 1776, the Second Continental Congress directed the colonies to frame new constitutions to replace their colonial charters. Americans' commitment to liberty, the core principle of Anglo American constitutionalism, was pushing them out of the empire. That June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced 3 resolutions in the Second Continental Congress. The first declaring that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress adopted those resolutions. 2 days later, it adopted a declaration drafted by Thomas Jefferson, setting forth the Americans' case against George III and for independence. The Declaration looks in two directions at once. It looks backwards as the last American word in the argument with Britain, and forward, charting the future political development of an independent America. It indicted George III because the king had spurned his last chance to avoid a breach with the colonies. Its famed preamble was key to its case against the king. Its citing of inalienable rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness formed the basis on which Americans could invoke the right of revolution against tyrant George III. And yet, the Declaration's preamble also states the principles upon which Americans would build their constitutions and political systems and govern themselves. Americans have continued to invoke the Declaration to advance the cause of democracy, equal rights, and individual liberty at home and around the world. Thus, the document by which the Second Continental Congress justified declaring independence found a life of its own as a cultural, political, and constitutional symbol, eclipsing the act it was intended to explain. Something I find very interesting is the Magna Carta. Um, the Magna Carta was really, I'm going to rest this right here. I'm sorry. No, I'm not. That's not going to work. The Magna Carta was a very interesting document, which a lot of, at least modern day Americans, don't actually know much about, even though it's one of the principal, not only documents, but also events in history upon which we basically predicate the modern sort of liberal West. I guess I'll take this moment to go into that history just a little bit. So, once upon a time, Britain fought a lot of Vikings who invaded their country. And the Vikings really conquered the entire island down to one little territory in the bottom. And that single territory was able to somehow coordinate with all of the other, English noblemen of the time. And they also paid a lot of money to Saxon, German mercenaries who came over. And they basically reconquered the entire country and eventually formed England. That's why it's called Anglo-Saxon, English and German blend. This is also why there's a lot of, sort of Nordic, German, and kind of indigenous Anglo population. And even farther back, there's some Roman influence in Britain. So it's kind of a cultural, multi-ethnic place these days. But that really, most of that blending occurred in the 1200s and 1300s in this kind of time frame that I'm talking about, where the Vikings really conquered the island and never left. Instead, what happened was when the English kind of took it back, people just blended together and they married into one another's families and so on and so forth. Um, Now, England kind of established like an English monarchy at that time, eventually uniting the entire island really for the first time under, as you know, kind of one England, one crown, one king, etc. And they've had fluctuations and different levels of difficulty after that. And the Vikings also had some levels of success in France, um, and even carved out some of their own empires. Fast forward, England goes through something called the Anarchy. The Anarchy was one of the largest anarchies in history. There really was no strong central government, no strong central governing authority. Um, it was basically a chaotic, stateless situation with a lot of people vying for power, a lot of war, and a lot of fighting. Because it's important to remember that ever since Rome left, which was a long time before that, um, there really wasn't one England. It was a lot of different peoples. So the unification sort of wasn't accepted by a lot of people. And so it fell apart eventually. Um, Now, when you look at the anarchy, that big moment of English history where there was kind of no state, um, other nations also saw this, and there was a group of French Vikings. It was a French Viking population who were also keeping their eyes on the island. And this group in particular was the Plantagenet dynasty. This is where this comes into play. So the Plantagenets actually sail across from the general area of France to the UK. Well, it wasn't the UK back then; it was England, or the territory known as England, because there was really no state. And they conquer the island. And the Plantagenet dynasty was so violent and brutal and bloody that it's actually the history that Game of Thrones is based on. So it was a brutal, um, you could say tyrannical kind of external authority which came in and conquered the local peoples. It was really the third time England was conquered. First, really by the Romans, then by the Vikings, now by the French Vikings. Really, the Vikings part two, but with a lot more French influence. Well, these French Viking, I guess you could call them invaders. They were pretty successful in their conquest, and they really stuck it out for a very, very long time. We're talking many, many generations um, of French Viking kings, French Viking monarchy, who controlled the island for a very, very long time. Um, and over the years, over decades and decades and decades, eventually the English nobility saw the French power going back and forth a little bit too much, and treating the local British peoples a little bit too badly. And what they ended up doing was, now keep in mind, this was a very heretical thing to do, but they um they actually, and this is the British were very serious about Christianity, and the way they practiced their religion was very, kind of by the book. Um, no swords in church, right? Well, not this time. So what they did was they actually rode on horseback to a church, walked into the church when the king, he's the king of England, right? But he's really a French descendant of French Vikings. So the English never fully recognized him as any kind of authority to them. Well, they rode into that church. They pulled out their swords, talking like 20 dudes with swords, in a church is a highly heretical thing to do. And they pointed their swords at him and they said, "If you don't sign this document, we'll kill you right here in this church. You better sign it." And he's like, "What? I thought you guys were like docile and highly religious people who wouldn't do something like this in a church." They're like, "Yeah, go ahead and sign it." The local people's had enough. And so, well, he ends up signing it because he could tell they weren't joking. A group of people can only take so much external tyranny before they snap, generally. That's how history goes. So, anyway, he signs this document, and it basically sets the early kind of humble beginnings of the British government that you see today. And people are, you know, often very confused by the British governmental system because they're like, why do you have a king or a queen or both and a prime minister and a governing body? And well, the reason for that is because ever since the signing of the Magna Carta, the British crown was really an external monarch who came and took the country over. And the British people clawed away at the authority of this governing power over hundreds of years. They didn't kill the king because they came from this insane anarchy and they had such an unstable governmental system for so long that the monarchy was actually kind of useful in holding things together. And they recognized that, but they wanted certain rights. They wanted certain privileges and abilities in their lives. So they clawed the power away and took it into their sort of representative governments, and the representatives were basically British nobles in the different territories. Well, in this way, the British parliamentary system is more British than the monarchy. So England has one of the most complemented, multi-ethnic, diverse um, political systems that's ever existed. Drawing inspiration from things like Rome, which had the House of the Plebs and things like that, but they made it very, very British, and then eventually they carved out, English common law, which were a set of rights and prescriptions for the average man and things like that. Um, and they built out this kind of impressive political document. And a lot of people just don't know the context of the Magna Carta, which is that was basically local people taking back their rights from foreign invaders. And the American government, the American system has some similarities, but it is different in some fundamental ways because really the colonies were people who left Britain, and many of the people who left had motivations to do the same kind of thing. They wanted to be able to practice their religion the way they wanted to practice it. You know, the Quakers and people like that. There were all of these different Protestant people who came to the United States because they had very specific kind of niche views on religion that weren't really accepted in England, in the 1700s. And that was back in a time when, it was not exactly a safe thing to perform your religion outside of the, culturally accepted bounds. So, um, anyway, we had similar motivations. People wanted additional freedoms and they wanted to be able to do things the way they wanted to do them. So they came to this new place, which was much farther away from the government. A lot of people with some shady motivations came over here too. A lot of career criminals who wanted to leave their old life behind and things like that. So in short, I'm painting the picture of kind of a rambunctious, rowdy, individualistic group who had strong opinions about things or motivations to do things their way. And then there's also a mix of kind of entrepreneurial minded people who wanted to be on the forefront of this new thing that was happening, this new place, this new space with all this opportunity and um, cheap land and anyway, it was an interesting time. It was a very different time. So, kind of similarly to the Magna Carta, um, people often want to do things the way they want to do them. They want to see the world the way they want to see it, and they're willing to do kind of amazing things to make that happen. Sometimes, such as fight a revolutionary war or move across the ocean to a new space. So, I think that's where we're going to call it for today on this reading of the Constitution. Um, I think I got to page 7. So I hope this was interesting. And if it was, we'll do it again. I think I'm going to go through the entire Constitution. I'm not sure which playlist I'm going to include it in, but if you thought it was interesting, please feel free to click like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye bye.